Well, I need a haircut. And that must mean that the semester's almost over. And that must mean Essay 4 is almost due. So let's talk about that a little. Yes, I know that Essay 3 was just due last week, but I do want to see some drafts of Essay 4 beginning this week. Don't worry, I don't need to see the full 10 pages or anything like that. What I'm really looking for this week with your drafts of Essay 4 is about 3 pages of writing, just kind of what you feel prepared to write about and how you're starting to organize things. I want to see a good working thesis, which you should already have because that's how Essay 3 should have ended. And I want to see starting to get a grasp of an outline of what Essay 4 is going to look like. So that's what we're looking for in the rough draft today, and I'll remind you of those requirements later on in this video. But yeah, the semester's almost over, so it's time to hunker down and get her done, as that comedian Larry the Cable Guy, I guess, says. That's what our motto, I guess, will be for the rest of the semester. Let's get this done. I'm going to be getting Essay 3 back to you, and as I do that, you can take my comments. I'm probably not going to leave a whole lot of comments on Essay 3, but I'll let you know what I think about your argument and how it's going. But really, the big thing now is to start to put together your big damn paper, as they call it, Essay 4. Start to think about what that's going to look like. You should have an argument now. You've worked with these sources, you're the expert, you've got lots to say, I'm sure. Now we just got to think about how to say it. So that's really what I want to cover in your lecture, in this week's video lecture. I want to talk about some tips for drafting Essay 4. So this week you're reading part 2 of They Say, I Say, which is the I say part. Right? Last week you read about dealing with what sources say, what they say. This week you're going to be reading about how to turn that around and talk about what you say. And that's really where you are in the semester. You've done your annotated bibliography, you've done your research narrative, so you've done all this research, you've collected all these sources, you've read through them, and you really are an expert now. You have a nuanced understanding of your topic and something to say about it, right? So you need to figure out how to go from what they say, how to go from those conversations you've been listening to, reading, and into what you say, right? How you step into the conversation. So we're going to talk this week in the lecture today about how to frame your argument, ways of structuring Essay 4, and reminding you of some things that you've already read this semester. And I'll also give you some tips based on some work that I'm doing. I'm going to show you a little bit of the work that I'm doing on a paper that I'm working on right now. So yes, I'm also writing a big damn paper, and we'll look at that. But let's start by talking about some strategies for getting into Essay 4, coming from Essays 2 and 3. So starting with Essay 2, the annotated bibliography, start to think about how your sources group together in groups or in clusters, and each of those groups will become an aspect of your argument. I know a lot of you have already seen connections, but make those connections explicitly and start to think about how you can group these sources together to most strongly support your argument. So these aspects of your research, which of them are the strongest? Which of them are the weakest as well? You want to know how well your argument holds up, how each of your sources works to support what you're trying to say. Or, of course, you probably have some points of opposition as well. And so pay attention to those and think about the ways that each of your sources work together, how you can go from one source to the next, and how those things work together to support the argument that you've come up with now, right? And then, of course, thinking about Essay 3, right? Which was, of course, your research narrative, and you reflected on your process, right? And hopefully the narrative revealed a structure for your argument, right? So as you were writing your story of how you went from having no argument to having an argument, that should reveal to you the sources and the parts of your process that most clearly support that argument, right? The things that most clearly create it. So those are the things that should be emphasized in Essay 4, thinking about how to put this together as a clear, solid, argumentative essay with good, solid support. So here's some tips for essay structure. Go back and review Chapter 10 of your Guide to Writing and Research at Oklahoma State, the argument on 3 argument structures by Ben Smith, and think about which of those will best suit your subject and your argument. It's an excellent chapter that really helps you figure out how to set up an argument. Consider those groups or clusters that you came up with, the groups of sources and how they work together, and how you move from one to the next, and maybe write some drafts based on those groups, right? So write about a group of sources, and then write about another group of sources, and then put them together in sections. That's one of the things that I do, and when I'm drafting, and we'll look at that here in a minute. And then, of course, always maintain a focus on your argument. This is what you always want to be sure you're doing as you're drafting, is really keeping that argument clear in your head, so that everything you do is always supporting your thesis. All right, so there's a few quick tips for things to be thinking about as you're starting to move towards Essay 4, ways of grouping the sources in your mind, so that you take sources that are closely related, and kind of write about them. Maybe take some of the stuff that you wrote in your annotated bibliographies, and put those paragraphs together, and then figure out how to write in between them, right? So you start to make those connections explicitly in your writing, and then you can put those together. Like, you can kind of copy and paste and put it all together as one large document. There's lots of different ways of going about this, and so these are just some suggestions, and I want to give you some more suggestions today, by actually looking at a paper that I'm working on. But it doesn't stop there. I have my process. Everybody has their own process, right? But be thinking about the papers that you've read, right? Look at the articles that you are dealing with. See how they're set up, right? One of the biggest complaints and one of the biggest fears that I always hear when it comes to Essay 4 is it's so long. I've never written a paper this long. I've never written a paper with this many sources. People get worried about that. My suggestion to you is, if you've really done the research, which most of you have, then it shouldn't be that big of a deal, because what you'll start to see is ways in which you can take the thoughts that you've already had and put them together, and then kind of write connections between each of your sources, and then put that together in the most effective way. A lot of your articles that you've probably read have probably had like subheadings and things like that, and so you might start to think about how you might use subheadings in your papers, how you might divide it up into, instead of one huge 10-page paper, maybe it's 5 2-page papers that are all sort of about the same thing, and you can put them together. I even have friends who sometimes print their papers out and cut them up literally with scissors into sections, and move those sections around on a poster board until it makes sense to them. That's all a possibility. So what I'm going to show you now are just some of the things that I do when I'm working on a revision, because I'm currently in the process of revising a paper that I've been working on for over a year now, and it's still not done, right? So we'll look a little bit at that. Not to give you any real clear ideas, but just to kind of show you what my computer screen looks like while I'm working, what I have open, how I deal with things, and maybe that'll help you, maybe that'll give you some ideas about ways of doing this. But really, the thing to be thinking about right now is all the connections that you've made in your mind. How do you start to make those explicit? How do you take the things that these sources are saying and put them together in order to help them help you say what you want to say? All right, so let's look now at my workspace as I'm working on a paper and a draft. So here I am. This is my desktop as I'm working. Right now I'm working on a paper, and this is a paper I've been working on for quite a while. And so the first thing I have open here is my proposal, right? This is the proposal for my paper, which is basically a combination of the research narrative and the annotated bibliography, right? So here's kind of like a summary of what I think my paper is going to cover, which is sort of like what your research narrative is, including a statement of the argument. And then I have the review of the literature and all this other stuff, and an extensive bibliography here, right? So this is very similar to the kind of thing that you'll have if you have your research narrative and annotated bibliography open. I always have this open when I'm working because it always reminds me of what I'm supposed to be doing, right? Sometimes if I get distracted, I can always come back to this and be like, oh yeah, I'm supposed to be saying this, right? Okay, all right. So that's good to always have open. Then I also, of course, this is the draft I'm working on. I'm working on the second draft. I also have over here the first draft, which has notes from my advisor who's helping me with this, right? So she's given me some really great notes, and I've always got that open so that I'm also, I'm working with that as I'm working through here. And then here's, the draft that I'm working with. One of the other things I always have open is another file that I like to call discards. Let me see if I can find it. Here we go. QP discards 2 right now. I have a discard file open at all times so that I can just copy or cut stuff out of my paper if I need to, and instead of just deleting it, I then put it into the discard file, right? And that way I always have everything that I've cut out. So if I go over to the first draft of this paper that I turned in a few months ago, it starts out with this stuff about this book, no caption needed, and the trials of Lenny Bruce. And I decided for the next draft, I got some notes on this, that this wasn't really a very good introduction to this paper. So what I did is I cut it out and I put it over here in my discard file, right? So here's the former introduction is now completely in the discard file, but that means it's still there. I can always come back and get it. This is a helpful way for me to keep track of everything, right? So I recommend doing that. So after I took those notes, right, then I started working, and let me get back to draft 2, and I've rewritten my introduction pretty much completely. started over from scratch on the introduction, and it still needs work. But then I get down to my thesis. My thesis now it's around page 3, I guess, and that's the thing with a longer paper. It doesn't necessarily have to be the last sentence of your first paragraph. It can be, but not always. For me, this is a 24-page paper right now. Page 3 is where my thesis is, but you can see right now, here it is, just as I've told you earlier in the semester. A good working thesis will say something like, in this paper I will. Here I have, I would like to build on this. So I'm very clearly saying, here's what they say, here's what Casper says, and here's what I'm going to say, right? This paper will examine the ways in which Lenny Bruce's visual persona develops on these album covers, right? So that's what I'm looking at. And then, as you can see, as you go through, I've decided to use subheadings, as many of the authors of your research probably do. One of the things that I think subheadings are very helpful is they help me then organize all those sources, right? So if I have a whole section on just what album covers are, so all of my sources dealing with that will be in this section. There we go. Then my next section is all about the album, the sick humor of Lenny Bruce, and the persona as clown. So anything that's dealing with that, I know goes in there, right? So I find these subheadings to be very helpful, especially in the drafting stage. They may not be there in the final stage. I don't know yet. We'll see. But for what they do in the drafting stage is they help me group my sources and my analysis so that I can then, I can take one day and decide, okay, today I'm going to write the section on the persona as clown, the sick humor of Lenny Bruce, and I'm just going to write that section. And once I've written that section, then I have it saved, and then I can move it around. You see this part begins on page 5 here in this draft. It began at a much different spot in the original draft. Let's see where it began on this original draft. We're still not there yet. We're still not there yet. We're still not there yet. There it is at the top or the bottom of page 10, almost on page 11. I've even changed the wording around a little bit, but this is the same section, but instead of being on page 11, it's now on page 5. And then, so what you can do if you have these things grouped like this is you can just cut and paste them and move them around in the most effective way, and then sort of rewrite your transitions so that everything starts to make sense. So hopefully this is sort of helpful just to sort of see how I'm working on things. I like to have all of these things open at once, as well as I always have the library homepage open in case I need to recheck on my sources or find something else out. But I always have lots of options here, lots of things going on, and of course, I'll have my Spotify open over there too. All right, but these are the things that these are the things that help me stay organized: is to work in sections, to work in bunches, and then to totally be willing to throw things out and start over and try again. So that's what I want to encourage you to do as you start to draft Essay 4. All right, well, there you have it. There's how I work. And maybe that's a little intimidating. It intimidates me, frankly. But that's, again, everybody's got their own way of doing things, but I wanted to just kind of give you some suggestions to help you figure out how I do it. Really, the best advice I can give you if you're worried about the length of this paper is don't think of it as a big paper. Think of it as several small papers about the same thing, right? Break it down and write it a couple pages at a time. Really, if you just, if you write 2 or 3 pages every couple days, you'll be surprised at how quickly this draft comes together and becomes a big damn paper. So your first few pages will be due to me this week, so that I can give you some comments on those and help you make sure you're moving in the right directions. But again, as always, keep in touch with me. Let me know if you have any questions. Here's your to-do list for this week. As always, read and take your quiz on part 2 of They Say, I Say. Blog and read my blog. Mine will be up probably a little later today. And then your rough draft will be due Friday. What I want to see is at least 3 pages of writing. It doesn't have to be in perfect working order yet, but I want to see at least 3 pages of thinking and writing and getting things down on the page, as well as a clear working thesis and a basic sort of outline. Where do you think this is going to go? Again, reread Chapter 10 of your Guide to Writing and Research at Oklahoma State. Think about the structure, think about the way that your sources work together, and let me know if you have any questions. I'll talk to you next week.